Hello and welcome to the Accessibility in Gaming podcast, the podcast about the accessibility, successes, and setbacks of all things gaming. I'm your host, Shelby Farley, also known as the Blind Gamer. Long time no speak. I am finally back to record another episode. It has been way too freaking long. If you ask me, life has been crazy. If you want updates on that, check out my main social media at Shelby Farley, but that's for another time and another place. I am glad to be back and recording again, and hopefully I can get a few episodes knocked out so I have stuff for ahead of time. But in today's episode, I will be talking about Dead by Daylight, which in a way is one of my favorite horror games. I don't necessarily find it scary, but I would consider it horror. I absolutely love it. It is just not very accessible, so until I was getting ready to record this podcast, I hadn't played it in probably over a year. I'm not exactly sure, but I would say probably over a year, just because it's so hard for me to play and get a full level of enjoyment out of. But I figured I would go ahead and talk about it. I said in the last episode that that's what we would be talking about today, so I figured, why not? So for those of you who don't know, to put it very basically, Dead by Daylight is a game where players can either be a survivor or a killer. And if you play as the survivor, then you have to complete and enable generators while trying to stay away from the killer and not be put on a hook. And then also after that, trying to escape the map, which is basically how you win. Along the way, in order to do generators, you have to complete skill checks. If you get caught by the killer and you get injured but not hooked, then you either have to try to heal yourself, have someone else heal you, or basically just kind of stumble around the map slowly, making a lot of noise, and just hope for the best. And if the killer catches you and puts you on a hook, you can either try to wiggle off of it, or get off of it basically, or hope that someone else that's playing the game will come and get you off of the hook for you. So it may sound sorta kinda easy, complete the generators and escape, but there's a lot to it. I kinda touched on that just now, but there's even more to it than that. But that's Dead by Daylight in a nutshell. Alright, on to the accessibility setbacks. Unfortunately, there are several, and the accessibility issues that there are pretty massive issues, which makes the game not unplayable, but a lot less enjoyable for me than I think it would be if I could see. One of the issues, as is a common issue in games that I've covered in this podcast, is the font, or at least most of the font, is too small. So when loading up with the game, you get different notifications about your dailies and any new content, various things like that. And I have to skip over all of that because if I can read anything, it's just the title. So, for example, playing before recording this podcast, I could see basically the title saying new content, for example, but I couldn't read what any of that new content was, so I just had to skip right over it. This is the case all throughout the game. Not only is the font in the notifications too small, that is the same with choosing whether you want to be survivor or killer or play with friends. And then also whenever you're getting ready to start the match, where you're choosing different items that you want to equip or perks that you want to have, the font is all too small for me. So I have to use my phone as a magnifier to even have a general idea of what I'm looking at, basically. Of course, one solution is to make the font larger, but I understand that that would screw up the appearance of the game visually, but it would definitely make things a lot easier for me and other visually impaired players, I would assume. The other option is to allow the ability to change the font size So you can make it bigger if necessary, but you can also leave it at the font size that it is right now. That way there's some customization available for those who need it. Or, as I've said before, my favorite option, which is having text-to-speech, where if you hover your mouse over, say, a perk, for example, it will read out audibly what that perk is and the description of it. This would make things a lot easier on my eyes or other people's eyes who have to strain to read what's on the screen with or without additional magnification through outside sources. Going along with that is another common issue, which is the contrast, especially when it comes to the contrast of the font on various backgrounds, but also the contrast between various icons and the background as well. This adds to the strain and the difficulty reading various options on screen, as well as knowing where to click for different items and interactions because I can't see where they are on screen. So, going along with basically the standard advice that I have for developers on many games, one option is to simply allow for players to adjust the contrast level themselves in settings. That way they can either, for example, leave it on normal settings or have a high contrast mode, which when I say high contrast mode, you could either have it where everything is high contrast or just menus are high contrast, because one issue I find with apps and software in general is a lot of times when you put on high contrast mode, the videos or pictures or whatever the case may be are completely screwed up because it's trying to make those high contrast as well. So ideally, the best option in my opinion would be to make the menus high contrast, or at least give players the option to do that while keeping most aspects of playing the game how they normally would be, or giving players the option to change all of it, or even just having the default for everyone be a high contrast version of the game. Another more unique issue that I have accessibility-wise with Dead by Daylight are the skill checks. So for anyone who doesn't know or hasn't played Dead by Daylight, when you are completing generators or various other tasks in the game, you have to complete skill checks. And from what I've heard, when that happens, there's an audible sound that lets you know it's popped up, and then also visually there's basically like a meter with an arrow pointing back and forth, and you have to try to get the arrow to stop in a certain field or a certain section of the meter, basically. I wouldn't know, because the big issue for me with skill checks is I can't see them at all. So there is an audio cue when they pop up on screen, but even then, I know it's popped up, but I can't see where it's at, and the skill checks go so fast that I don't have time to try to figure out where it is. So it makes skill checks impossible for me to do at all, and I end up doing what is called gen tapping, where you hold down the mouse button to work on the generator for like half a second, and then stop, and then another half a second, and then stop, because that's the only way I've found to avoid the skill checks, which allows me to work on generators, but because I'm just gen tapping, I can't make nearly as much progress as if I would be able to if I could do the skill checks. Something to note is if you get a skill check and you miss it, then the gen basically not really explodes, but makes like a loud banging, and also sets your progress back a good amount. So it sets your progress back and also notifies the killer about where you are, roughly. So it's very important that if you're completing the generators as you typically would in Dead by Daylight, that you complete the skill checks. Otherwise, it will set you, and potentially the people that are also working on the generator with you, back quite a bit. It'll cause a lot of complications and possibly get you killed. So one way I would find to modify this or make it more accessible is to make the visuals larger. So having the meter or whatever you want to call it larger so that I or other visually impaired people can see where it's at on screen and see what exactly they need to try to hit for the skill check. Another aspect to that is slowing the skill check down, because it's really hard, at least for myself, to keep track of where the pointer is pointing to, because I'm not able to see as well, and so it's harder for me to keep up with. The other option is to add more audio cues to the skill check. So not only making a sound when the skill check pops up, but also when you need to press the button to complete the skill check. That way, even if it's not visually larger, myself and other visually impaired people can actually complete, or at least have a chance at completing the skill checks. I will say though, while there are several setbacks, and while they are major setbacks, there is a big thing that the game does really well, and that is audio cues. While I still believe that text-to-speech and high contrast and bigger font and all of those things are still very important, the game does have a lot of audio cues, which is amazing. Whenever you're navigating menus, every time you hover over something, there's a audible alert that lets you know that you've hovered over something or moved past something. And then in the game, if the killer is near you, you will hear music or a heartbeat or different things like that to let you know that they're near. And there's even a perk called Premonition that will make a sound when you're looking in the direction of the killer, if they're close enough. So the audio cues in this game are fantastic. There's even audio cues for when you enter a lobby, when the game starts, when players join the lobby. There are so many audio cues in this game, which I absolutely love. Because some games, like Phasmophobia, while they are amazing and I like them better than this one, they do not have nearly as many audio cues, and it makes things a lot harder for me than it is with this game in that aspect. So I really find the audio cues very helpful in this game. Another thing that the game does well is there is a perk, I am blanking on the name, but there is a perk that allows you to see where other players and things are on the map, highlighted in what I believe is a yellow or maybe orange color. Even if you're looking and there's a wall in front of you, if they're in that direction, you can see that they're there. And so that's really helpful for me if, say, the gates are unlocked to allow us to escape, so I can look around the map and see which direction I need to go to get to the gate, where normally I would have to basically try to get to the edge of the map and then run around the edge of the map until I can find a gate to escape, which is not a very good thing to have to do because the killer's going to be looking around the edges of the map, most likely. That used to get me killed a lot more than I do now before I discovered this perk. So to kind of wrap things up here, overall, there are a lot of setbacks to this game, like I've said many times, which leads me to play this maybe once every few months at most. Like I said, it's probably been over a year since I've played it before getting ready for today's episode, so I don't play it very often because it is very visually challenging. Everyone's vision is different, so I can't really say as far as exactly how everyone would do, but for people that are visually impaired, like myself, honestly, it's going to be hard to play. I will say that. If you have fairly good vision, even though you're visually impaired, then you might not have as much trouble with it. But for someone with really bad vision like myself, you may potentially struggle with it. That being said, I have seen people that are completely blind play this game, and other visually impaired players play this game, and they enjoy it a lot. They, from what I remember, had someone basically being their eyes in terms of getting things set up. Then on the map, they pretty much played by themselves, even though they couldn't see where they were going. They just used the amazing audio cues. So at the very least, try it out if you have the opportunity. Just know that it's going to be pretty visually challenging. But it is a great game, and on the rare occasion that I do play it, I enjoy it. Not as much as I think I would if I could see, but I definitely do enjoy it, which is why I keep coming back to it. But those are my thoughts on Dead by Daylight. If you are blind or visually impaired, or have any other disability, let the other listeners and I know your experience and what you think of the game and how accessible it is. In next week's episode, I will be discussing a different type of game. Instead of video games, I will be discussing a tabletop game, which will be Clue, one of my childhood favorites. So definitely check that out next week if you enjoyed this episode or you would like to know about something other than video games. If you are a game developer or you create anything related to games such as keyboards, game consoles, headsets, anything like that, let me know if you want me to try out your game or device and review how accessible it is, at least from my perspective. If you would like to connect with myself and other listeners, check out my social media. My username is TheBlindGamer, TheBlindGaymer. You can find me with that username at YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, Twitter, and Steam. Thank you so much for listening to the Accessibility and Gaming Podcast.